Today, down the rabbit hole, who's making the news? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one that is post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today I'm joined by my friend George. Hi George.
Hello Martin.
We did a show a few weeks ago talking specifically about some of the issues to do with the election. Towards the end of that show we said, hey, there's a big conversation to be had about the media, the role of the media and all sorts of things, and we both agreed that's something we want to talk about. So tonight, tinfoil hat on again, and let's go down the rabbit hole and talk about how the media works, how the news is made, how the stories are selected, what commercial interests drive it, and what they won't talk about.
Well, that's a huge topic, Martin. Look, I think I should preface this with the tin hat on to say I'm now at my 13th year of investigating the world that I thought we lived in. And the more I investigate, just so you know, the more I start to come to the conclusion that the world is not the way we're told it is. And as a result of that, and having worked in mainstream media as well, it's all compartmentalised. So if you're working within CNN or a major broadcaster like the ABC, you don't get to see every aspect of what's going on. You see little bits and pieces. And we tend to focus on our own little input. So we tend to look at our own stories, and we often don't tend to look at the international stories, and we think, well, the international stories are for the people doing international stories, not my problem. I'll just focus on the local stuff, and occasionally a politician will drop in, we'll do an interview with them. Didn't think too much about it. I always thought the politics, the left favoured the lower classes and the right favoured the upper classes. That was my mainstream belief. I don't know, how did you view it? Did you view it very similar, Martin?
Well, you see, I was quite lucky because I did quite a lot in local radio when I was a student. And through that, I started to meet quite senior people inside the BBC. And when I started talking to them, not, about individual news items, but about how the news is made, I very quickly started to realise that there's more going on than meets the eye. Now, the first point is, if you think about a news bulletin, right, somebody is making a choice about what to head the news off with and what topics to include in the news, all right? And, it's an obvious thing once you think about it, because, of course, somebody's got to decide, well, where are we going to send our resources? How are we going to chase down a particular story? All those sorts of things. What are we going to cover? What are we not going to cover, right? Now, the point is, of course, that depending on your view of the world and depending on your perhaps political preferences and where you're working in the media, you might have different ideas about what should be in the news or not in the news. So the first point to make is the news is not objective. The news is actually driven by somebody making choices left, right and centre, right? That's the first point. The second one is the BBC was very strong on balance, the idea of balance. So in other words, if you had one point of view here, you needed to find somebody with the other point of view there because they don't want to take a position, all right? Now, that's quite interesting. And of course, if you take things like climate change, for example, there are many people say, well, you can't have two positions on climate change. It's either real or it's not, right? But the true balance argument would be, well, you'd have somebody who said there's a problem, and somebody would say there isn't a problem, and you'd get them to talk with each other, and they would facilitate the story, right? So this concept of balance and having multiple points of view. Now, I would argue that that's pretty much thrown out the window most of the time these days, right? So, but years ago. The third point is, if you then start looking at the ownership structure, and particularly in commercial media, and what drives commercial media rather than public service broadcasting, I started to realise quite early that the money actually drives everything, right? Because they're worried about advertising revenue. In the old days, when there were a small number of channels, all about advertising revenue, or about eyeballs or clicks or whatever. And so, again, there is a whole set of commercial relationships and commercial imperatives that drive the selection of particular news items or not, right? So that's how my journey started. And the final point is I spent some time in the US. I remember sitting down talking to a couple of very senior journalists in Washington. And they said to me, do you know that inside the broadcasting structure in the US, there are people with direct affiliations to the CIA, and that's actually part of the structure of the process. So, it's not like nobody knows about it, right? It's actually within the structure. Now, if you pull that together, so you've got basically somebody setting the agenda, somebody potentially driving based on commercial imperatives or not, and somebody effectively possibly connected with the political processes and political structures. And suddenly you start realizing that this objective, simple process of making the news and, the media in particular is way more complicated and is actually, probably not what you think it is.
Well, that's a good point, Martin. What you mentioned about the CIA and having Secret Service actually as part of the media unit, that brings around a big question. Why would they use Secret Service in the media? Now, I think the picture's really big here because it seems to me that this all ties up with the UN agendas 2021, agendas 2030. Follow the money and you'll find a trail of control. And we come home, we sit down in front of the TV. We used to have a man in Channel 9. His name was Brian. They made a little song which went something like, Brian told me so. I know everything I need to know because Brian told me so. Now, when you ask people about the truth, well, if it's not on the news, I saw it on the news. Television.
Yeah.
People believe what they see on a TV. Now, if I wanted to make an allegation, I controlled the information. I could control the views of people by creating some distraction, drawing their attention to it. And because we live on the other side of the world, we've got no way of checking. So I'd hear the report and I'd say, oh, wow. So Ukraine at the moment, fresh in the headlines, Russian soldiers attacking civilians, raping women, etc. Very emotive information. What's it going to do? It's going to get the Western viewer who's sitting at home comfortable thinking, oh, how dare they? And they're reacting to the information that they're being given, believing every piece of information. The problem is that, look, you're a climate change activist role. I'd be a climate change denier. My denying is more to do with the fact that I've heard this repeated and repeated and repeated, which goes on to the Joseph Goebbels model where you repeat information. But when it comes down to information, the media could give you statistics and say, well, here's the data. Oh, the data looks quite precise. I mean, that looks relative. It's academic. It's a paper. They've done tests. It all looks legitimate. Now, you're going to believe that based on what the media or whoever pushes out that data. The problem is, you know yourself, Martin, when we look at the banking system, we look at economics, etc., that things are not quite as they seem. And I suppose that's why philosophy questions everything. But my conclusions are that I was working for an organisation which is basically, and I hate to say it, involved in propaganda. And by the way, I think you'll find that all media organisations are involved in propaganda, so let's not get ahead of ourselves and say, oh, how dare you pick on just the Western media. I believe that all media is a form of propaganda when governments are involved, and I think it's always been that way. Maybe now that we start to see things the way they are, we're starting to think, wow, this story is getting a little bit stretched now. I mean, with the coronavirus, they've been saying talking about all the deaths, etc. and that the next one's even more contagious. Every time a new virus would come out, more contagious than the previous one. And you think, well, they're so contagious, but we haven't had that many deaths so far, considering the level of contagiousness, I suppose. So I think that there's a much bigger picture here. And I think you'll find that if you look at some of the US, if you've ever looked at US TV, there's a couple of videos going out saying alternative media is dangerous to our democracy, and then another picture appears. Before you know, you've got about 60 pictures across the screen while all of the news anchors are reading the same script. Now, you've got to ask yourself, I think there's something not quite right here, because I thought if media was independent, they'd create their own scripts. And that brings you to the point of 9/11, when we went to Iraq, and I think I may have mentioned this in a previous video we spoke on, where John Howard and the Prime Minister of Canada made identical speeches pledging allegiance to going to war with the USA on Iraq for weapons of mass destruction, which, by the way, they never found. So then the next story comes on. That's gone now. We've forgotten about that. I haven't forgotten about it, but most people have. And so we're on to the next one. And funny how they get their intelligence wrong. And then we've got Julian Assange, who has been or is going to be extradited to the US for basically telling the truth. So, Martin, what do you have to say of what I've just mentioned? That's a lot.
Okay, so let me just sort of make the point. I think it is very interesting that, you know, they can decide what the order of items are in the news, but actually if you watch the 4 or 5 mainstream channels, right, they pretty much have the same, you know, they've got the same stories in roughly the same order with very, very similar viewpoints quite often. Almost makes me wonder, well, why do you have 5 channels, you know, and they might have it different times a day, but it's all very much the same. You get the same stuff. So that's the first point. So there's a lot of that goes on. The other point is that with the proliferation of multiple channels and, you know, the real-time social media and everything, right, we've now got a proliferation of channels and a proliferation of information points. But actually, within the mainstream sector, there isn't huge diversity, right? Now, I've never understood this. To me, in a democracy, you would expect to have, you know, a million butterflies all sort of flying around, right, with different flavors and different types and different, you know, viewpoints. But actually, we seem to boil it back and boil it back and boil it back, and it actually very much aligns to what the government is quite keen for everybody to know, and, you know, you link it into government advertising, and you know, so and a lot of it is reporters now basically reporting what the government is saying about particular things. So look at this political campaign, right, that we've had in the last few weeks. There's almost no real independent journalism other than the odd gotcha, right? Most of the case, what it is they turn up, somebody does a thing, they ask Mickey Mouse questions, and then we all go away again, right? As though somehow that's democracy in action. No, that's not. It's controlled. So there is an agenda there that flows through to the way that the media reports. Now, I would argue that it's happening pretty much all the time. Now, then the question is, well, you know, is it malicious? Is it controlled? And you mentioned propaganda. Now, what does propaganda mean? Propaganda means putting out a particular perspective on a consistent, methodical basis with a view to influencing outcomes. Right? Now, my favourite book, or one of them, is 1984, right? And of course, the author of 1984 was a journalist. Mm-hmm. And his point was the media is the message, right? The media is control, and he who controls the media and the message controls you. That's what that book was about. And I actually think it's very important that we don't forget that, right? And particularly now with the technological advancements and, you know, the wall-to-wall media and everything else, that he who controls the message controls you. So I am extremely skeptical of everything that I see and everything that I hear, because I don't just want to sort of swallow it hook, line and sinker.
Well, I'll give you a little bit of my analogy on climate change. Okay?
Oh, yeah.
It's not a criticism of you, Martin, but I see a much more sinister and darker agenda on the rise. Climate change leads to electric cars. Electric cars can be controlled by 5G, and it's all about more and more and more control. So what I'm suggesting is that climate change is the conduit going along with the agenda that the media are pushing. Remember, they repeat this message over and over again. You should be very sceptical about this, Martin. By the way, I'm actually a big on the environment, so understand that if we'd be in agreement on looking after the environment, and I don't think we've actually looked after the environment at all. We've got plastics and all sorts of materials that go into landfill. We waste a lot where we don't need to. We rebuild. Melbourne is set up for a future city called a smart city, along with Tokyo, New York, London. I never, in our democracy, I don't know if the citizens ever planned this, but the people in charge certainly have been thinking about it. And so the question is, what have you achieved by bringing into the media the idea of climate change and global warming? Well, you've achieved fear, concern, division, because there are people who don't believe in it. But I think you'll find any normal person would want to look after the environment. Let's be honest here. I think that's something we could all agree on. As far as global warming and climate change, I tend to be on the other side of the fence, not because I believe in burning lots and lots of carbon, but carbon is a natural process for the Earth anyhow. Whether we were here or not, volcanoes would occur, they'd create carbon. You're not going to stop volcanoes. So you're not going to stop bushfires. That's not going to stop. It's a natural process of the Australian bush. So I think when it comes to the media, the way I see it is the media on an international basis is being controlled a bit like from a central point. What do they say? Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. So George Orwell's film, I saw it. I could see how it works in today's modern society. Instead of a large crowd of people staring at a huge screen, that large crowd of people is sitting at home, all watching their own individual huge screens, taking in the same subject. And something that you often hear from people is, did you see the news last night? Like, I'm up to date, I'm aware, I know what's going on. And I hate to say it, but the way I see the world today is one massive, international, multicultural psyop. It's that big. When John F. Kennedy was talking about a monolithic conspiracy, I just thought, what's he talking about? I'd seen videos of people making allegations that international corporations and were controlling our lives, and I thought, no, I can go out my door, I can do what I like, where's the control? But the reality is it's subconscious control. What happens over a long period of time is people start to compare notes, because everybody wants to find the middle ground to see that they fit in with society. Sometimes they get a group of people on one side finding their middle ground, and they're empowered, and then they get a different group on the other side finding their middle ground. What often happens is groups will form with opposing views. Like you were mentioning before, that we balance the news, we need opposing views. When we have opposing views, we have friction. When we have friction, we often have people not being so nice to each other because they think that the other person's got it all wrong. It would be really nice when people actually have a different view to sit down and discuss things like we are now, but often that'll never be allowed to happen. So we have, what I'm seeing today is, okay, we have the coronavirus, the pro-vax versus the anti-vax versus the free choice. Just because somebody doesn't take a vaccine doesn't mean that they're opposed to it. It might mean that they've decided, no, they don't want to try this particular vaccine. But then if you look at the vaccine industry, to understand it, you'd have to go right back to its inception. It didn't just spring out of thin air. Does a polar bear come to Pfizer and say, you better give me a shot in the arm because I could get that coronavirus? You know what I mean? The fact of the matter is, what I'm saying is that when you have this level of control, and I'm talking extreme now, that is so subtle and so well done that people don't pick up on it until one day the penny drops. And then you go, I've got a question and I don't seem to have an answer. I'm looking for an answer, but I don't seem to have one. What do you think, Martin?
So, look, I think it's quite interesting how there are polarizations pretty much everywhere, right? As you say, you know, pro and anti, you know, the whole vaccine issue or climate change. You know, in a way, those are, I think, they're false dichotomies, right? They're actually almost created for effect. And I actually have a view that some of this is about turning, you know, a focus and anger on particular things and particular agendas. Maybe that's deliberate, you know, maybe it's actually empowered and stoked a little bit by the social media channels and by all the partisanship, right? Now, you know, it seems to me that in an adult society, we should be able to have differences of opinion and we should be able to debate issues and we should still be able to respect somebody who has a different point of view. But no, that isn't the way it happens. What happens is if you actually aren't on the same side of the argument, or if you're not supporting the right club or whatever it is, right, then basically, no, can't have that, right? I mean, I see that on social media all the time. Sometimes they're quite rude to me on my channel, right? Because they think that I've got a particular point of view. Actually, I've been quite broad churched, I think, in terms of how I've allowed people with different opinions to come on the channel. But the point there is that you very soon get into this echo chamber effect where effectively your views then start to get more and more reinforced because you tend to be served through social media with material that actually reinforces the view you've got. And then, of course, also you tend to be selective in terms of where you go for your information. And the more you do that, the more you go down a particular line so that effectively your view is reinforced. Now, I'm a philosopher, right? And I always want to step back one and think, well, hang on a moment, why is that happening the way it is? And what's behind the question, right? Because actually that's a really important thing. So if you take the whole question of, you know, climate change or whatever you want to call it, and global warming, etc. You know, I start from a simple premise, right? We have one planet, right? We have one planet, and if we're not careful, we're going to actually make it impossible for us to continue to live on it into the future, right? Mm-hmm. Which is an environmental and a conservation-led view. I don't know what's caused it. I don't know whether it's actually natural or whether it's actually created by, you know, all the carbon. All I do know is, from observation, we're getting more floods, we're getting more high temperatures, we're getting more rainstorms, there's more dynamism in the atmosphere. That is observable. But then to say, therefore, it's 100% this or it's 100% that, right? I don't think anybody can say that, right? But the question is, we've only got one Earth. Right? This is basically our spaceship. So if we are in the situation where by doing X rather than Y, we potentially can create an environment which is actually less and less able to sustain life, that's a problem to me. And that's how I go. And you know, that's why I think David Attenborough, for example, is worth listening to, because he goes along that argument and says, here is evidence that shows you that things are actually not well, you know, and he can show you the plastic in the oceans and inside fish, and, you know, the polar bears can't find the ice anymore, and those things. Those are observable facts. Trying to work out what's driving them, what's causing them, is much more complicated. And that's when you start then looking to the media to say, well, they're saying it's X, or they're saying it's Y, right? But often X, and therefore that must be the right answer. Now, that gets a bit more complicated because I agree with you. There are a bunch of arguments you can put on the table one way, a bunch of the arguments you can put on the other way. There isn't enough to be able to actually determine which is true, which is not, I think, at the moment. And yet, if you look at the weight of the coverage in the media, it's taking a particular form, a particular process, a particular line and view. And actually, another example is this right-left, politics of the left, politics of the right, as though you've got to decide which side of the dividing line you are, right? Now, even things like the ABC Vote Compass, it's actually quite like that. If you actually go through and do your thing, you almost are forced to sort of go that way or that way, right? Now, the right and left, that's another false dichotomy, and quite often, actually, if you really understand where people are, they'll often have the mix of views that really don't naturally fit between right and left, but it's convenient for the media to be able to actually portray it as left and right and etc. So again, you've got another false structure and a false narrative and a false set of messages that is actually underpinning the way that stories are told and the way that the media communicates. And I'm just using those as examples, right? Because the point I want to come back to is the news is made, quote unquote, by somebody, right? Choices are made as to what to show or what not to show, right? Choices are made in terms of which pictures, which items, what order, how much time, etc., etc., etc. And very interestingly, of course, if you think about the current election, there are some parties that are getting lots of coverage. There are many other parties that are getting no coverage. Now, that's a very interesting observation, isn't it?
I've got an answer for you here. First of all, when JFK was saying a monolithic conspiracy, all I'm going to say is he wasn't kidding. I didn't realise how powerful those words were. I didn't realise to what extent. But there is an agenda and it's pushing through. And you've seen aspects of it with the World Economic Forum. Look at the World Health Organization, total centralised control of world health. Now that's got to tell you something. That's a bit scary, because the idea that only a massive corporation with obviously interests in making profits, and of course, how is it? I mean, how would you love to have a business where you could tell the government, I've got these demands, I need a certain amount of customers, you're going to force those customers to come and use my product, and there's no warranty on the product, no warranty. So the point I'm trying to make here is that once you realise it's gone that far, then you say, okay, global warming, climate change, television, images, constant repeating of the same narrative, constant showing polar bears, showing plastics which are going into the ocean. We've clearly got a problem with recycling, obviously. Polar bears, well, of course, if there's a polar bear that's suffering or whatever, or due to if it is climate. Have you ever heard the term cloud seeding, Martin?
Yes, and I quite often get people talking to me about, don't forget the chemtrails.
Yes, okay. Do you remember when we used to watch TV at home? We'd see Dick Tracy with his watch, and I used to look at that and think, never going to happen. I mean, yeah, okay, we've come out of two-way radios, etc., and they're talking about somebody watching somebody on a watch, and we've got black and white TV, and there's this watch. I'm thinking, no, that's not going to happen. Of course, it has happened.
Yep.
The point I'm trying to make is that I'm not disputing the idea of looking after our Earth. I agree with you. We only have one Earth. This planet has been around for a very long time. All of a sudden, in a very short space of time, in probably about the last 20 to 30 years, progressively the idea of climate change and global warming has been added to the narrative through the media, and also through movies showing climate effects, etc., hurricanes, etc. When you control the music industry, the film industry, the news industry, the money, the politicians, the education system. You've got to ask yourself, Martin, just how much of that is affecting your judgment, and how do you push back? And how do I go to the news and say, ask them to give me the statistics or the science, etc.? How do I go to them? Because the news always has the last say. And whether or not the news is actually factual or not, they always get the last say. Always. So we're left with this paradigm of what media we have today. Now, if I had to describe the media of today, we're talking about 2022 now, the media of today is the newspapers, your mainstream television, mainstream radio. Then you've got the internet. Who controls the bulk of searches on the internet? Well, that would be Google. Then you've got YouTube, and then you've got Facebook. These are probably the strongest media units around. Then, tinfoil hat on, along come the alternative media charging on their horses, trot, 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 trot. And they come up and they ask questions and they get different answers. They post these answers up on, say, something like YouTube. Suddenly, within 5 minutes, they get struck off inappropriate for public viewing. Excuse me? Is this censorship we're looking at here? So what happens with these alternative media is they realise very quickly that they're never going to penetrate through the use of search engines such as Google or YouTube or even Facebook. So they go searching for other outlets. And what happens is the people who wake up suddenly realise that the search engines are tainted or manipulated. They suddenly realise, hang on a second, this search engine is trying to guide me down a different path. Then they find out alternative views and they start comparing the two. They go, how come they said this and these people said this? Then you get to the point where, like the protests that we've had in Melbourne and Sydney and all around Australia, and then like, for example, in Melbourne there was police fired rubber bullets on the protesters twice, by the way. I rang up a friend who's very pro Dan Andrews and told him about it. He said, oh, they were violent. And I thought, if I was prepared to actually introduce crisis actors and then have my crew appropriately positioned at the right time to take pictures of these crisis actors, to show police being attacked in some way, then I might look at the protesters and think, oh, they're violent. And of course, then the ABC and the rest of the commercial media repeating the idea they're anti-vaxxers and they're far right-wing extremists and racists. I'm thinking, okay, can you name the people you interviewed? Can you tell me their names, what they said, how many you actually spoke to? Now, Margaret Thatcher was asked a question some years back. I can't remember the journalist's name, but he was a current affair or 60 Minutes. And he said, people on the streets are telling me that they're not happy with your policies. And she said to him, can you tell me who, when, where you actually interviewed these persons? Well, people are telling me. He said, can you give me the names of the people, what they said? He couldn't give her an answer. So the media has a lot of power in that it can make blanket statements and never has to present any evidence. You understand where I'm going with this? It puts into question just exactly what sort of media do we have. And having worked for the media, of course, I was very proud working for a national broadcaster and proud of what I did, proud of the stories that we covered. I never, ever thought in my wildest dreams that the media would be propaganda, because I thought I was doing a good service. But I did see the occasional situation. We went along to a bunch of, there was out where they were tree logging. This group of people were actually chaining themselves to the trees, and they were prepared to stay there for as long as it took to stop the tree logging. Now, I actually looked at them and I thought, good on them. I mean, they're standing up for something they believe in. They obviously have looked at what's going on. They don't want to see any more logging and deforestation. I actually kind of was quite sympathetic. Yet the rest of the media that was there with me were being quite derogatory, saying, why don't they just go home and get a job? As if it didn't matter to them They were comfortable. They had their pay packet. They were going to go home to a nice warm bed. They could afford to do things. These people were putting everything on the line because of something they believed in. To me, I actually respect that. So when I see the global warming situation, the climate change, given that it's been repeated for such a long time, I have to say you still need to kind of consider the question, is there something more to this than what we're told? Remember the resources they have. They have, as JFK said, this is a monolithic conspiracy. I actually believe him. And if you look at where the plan is one world government, one world currency, digital, UBI, social credit score that you've mentioned a few times, and also a one world religion, which, speaking to my friends, they say it'll never happen. You say, well, sorry to say this, but so many things have happened in the last 2 years where they're tracking you. Has anybody not stopped for a moment to say, is this normal for us to actually have QR codes and health records? What seems to be happening is there seems to be a push which has polarised governments around the world, taken over the democracies of the world, and governments have gone off in a tangent, off in a direction that nobody expected. The problem is that people have actually started to ask questions, and they're starting to say, well, this doesn't seem right. I mean, we've been locked down, we've had to do QR coding, we've had to do health checks, etc. The mandates have not been fully lifted. If you're not vaccinated, you can't work. Some people would say, well, that's right, because they're not doing the right thing. And you think, well, do you know what doing the right thing is to me, Martin? What do you think? What do you think doing the right thing would be in terms of taking a vaccine under these circumstances? Give your thoughts. You can actually tell me I'm wrong. I don't have a problem, but give me your view on that.
Well, I think people should be able to make their own decision, and they should be able to judge for themselves. I certainly don't think that central imposition is the right way to go. I mean, I've always believed in personal freedom, and I think that with personal freedom comes responsibility. But a lot of people want the shortcuts. A lot of people want to be told what to do. And of course, a lot of the media really only chops information to very small chunks, right? So there's very little analysis, and as you say, they quite often just repeat the same things again and again and again. Now, maybe we are our own worst enemies insofar that I keep getting messages from people saying, oh, I haven't got time to listen to this, I'm too busy, right? I want the instant version, right? Well, actually, the problem is with instant versions is that quite often the truth disappears, right? Because actually a lot of things are way more complicated than might first appear. And of course, if you just grab the instant truth version, you never actually start questioning, diving down, understanding what's really going on. So I've always believed that actually with maturity and, with, I guess, adulthood comes responsibility, not just to swallow the first thing that somebody chucks at you, right? Not just say, well, it must be true if it's on this channel or if that person said it or whatever. Or worse still, if that A-lister said it, or if that particular person who's famous because they've been in films says it must be true, right? And I think that's another very weak set of arguments. What gives them the right to...
I'll tell you what, Martin.
Yeah.
How about we talk about something that you understand much better than most, and that's economics. Yeah. And I think you do have a good understanding on economics. And here's the point I'll make. We've had this war going on with Ukraine and Russia. Suddenly the cost of fuel's gone up. And I've spoken to a neighbour who's very concentrated on media. She told me, I don't mind paying a little bit more for my fuel, anything to take down Russia. So they've created the division. You see the point?
Yeah.
Now, they're blaming Russia for things like the economy and the inflation that's happening.
Yep.
How
very
convenient,
isn't it?
And yet, if you look at the amount of money printing that the Liberal Party did and where that money went and how it affects the person on the street, and plus combine it with the policies of the mandates for people not working, and then they brag about how how there's so many jobs available. Well, that's probably because the people who are not vaccinated don't have those jobs and they need people to fill them. So I just see, I think that this election that's coming up, and with the media pushing the way they are, it certainly are pushing towards the two major parties. The minor parties don't seem to get much of a say. Even on 3AW recently, Morgan C. Jonas, who's an independent, actually rang up the station to speak to Neil Mitchell, who's a very, very popular radio presenter in Melbourne, prime time. And Neil Mitchell decided to try and take him down a corridor, speaking about how much money is he going to allocate for budgets. He's an independent. I mean, he hasn't even gotten in yet, and here we are talking. He said, look, I will be looking at all these things once I get in, but I have to get in first. But what's important are the issues. And the issues are a high cost of living, very few freedoms. We've been in a lockdown. The mandates are not released. It's mostly released. No, hang on. The mandate for working without a jab has not been released. So we still have that problem. So don't try to make out like it's a flippant thing, because there are people around who are actually sitting at home, living off their savings or getting Centrelink payments and actually suffering. So I don't see how that's a fair system. And if you remember, ScoMo said, if you have a go, you get a go. Well, those people are still waiting for their go. So
I think they're go-gont.
Well, if you have a go, you get a go. Well, what is it? When the going gets tough, the tough get going. Yeah. I'd have to say that when it comes to the media, there's just too much temptation for governments around the world not to use the media for their advantage. But I'm saying it goes much bigger than that. I'm saying it goes into the film industry, into the music industry. It riddles the newspapers. There's censorship now as well. You've got to be a little bit kind of concerned when you're seeing all these things come together, and then you've got to ask yourself, well, just how much of this is true? Is it true anymore? The other question is, well, if climate change is not real, let's consider that for a moment. What is the agenda of using climate change then? I mean, what would they do? I can see they benefit with sales of solar panels. They could benefit with controlling where the future of our car fleets are going. And once you get into electronic cars, you have electronic control. And I just see control at every point. I would describe modern society like a chain, and you're one link in the chain. And if one of those links breaks, the whole lot falls over. So imagine you're going along to present your credit card, because we love our digital money. Might be fake, but we love it. And it's all debt, by the way. So you go to present your card, and the person at the teller says, I'm sorry, Mr. Adams, your card doesn't appear to be working today. So you say, here, try another one. And they try another one. I'm sorry, Mr. Adams, that card's not working. And you try another one, and that one's not working. You say, oh, can I use cash? I'm sorry, we don't take cash at this store, because we've got a policy, we only take digital money. Now you've got to walk out of the store. Can you see the control that we've got going on here? All I'm saying is, I'm not saying that I'm right, you're wrong. What I'm saying is what I see. And what I see is massive control through the film industry, through our news, through our education system, the things that kids are being taught at school, the information that we get, which again is controlled and filtered. Now, if you just take the mainstream narrative and look at it, you're going to get one point of view, a bit like 1984. I think that should at least concern you, but if you're being a bit more realistic, it should actually send chills down your spine, the concept. That's what I see, Martin. That's extreme. It means that when America wants to put out a story, it sends its information from one source and spreads it all around the world as the same information. Now that is scary, because it means that you're only going to get one view. Now, I actually went to Canberra as an alternative news person, and I interviewed people who went to Canberra and asked them to tell me their story. And they told me their story. They said, I'm a nurse. I do cleaning because I can no longer work as a nurse because I'm not vaccinated. And I'm living out of the boot of my car because I've lost my home. That's how far she was prepared to go, while others would take the vaccination. It's not a fight about the vaccination. It's what it is. It's about the fact that she doesn't get to have her voice presented on the news. I would have thought that should be quite interesting. It should be information that we should all hear. But she wasn't the only one. There were others. And then there were vaccine injuries, etc., which are not necessarily being spoken about. We've got to go along this kind of narrow path following the news services telling us where we're going. I'm very sceptical. I didn't used to be, but my down the rabbit hole investigation that's taken now 13 years has brought me to the conclusion, I know what the world isn't. I'm just trying to find out what the world really is. And so that's why my investigations of down the rabbit hole occurred. But I had to cross-reference, Martin, so many things. I didn't just take the first piece of information, but the information I was getting painted a picture that was far more realistic, like the pharmaceutical industry. Well, okay, I've spoken to a friend of mine who's very kind of concerned about the vaccination, but he's very quick to tell me, yes, but the vaccine companies cured polio. You know that, George. I remember the time. I remember them issuing the vaccine. I remember having the syrup that they gave you at the time. They gave you like a pink syrup. I didn't think twice about it. I thought, well, this is the health industry. Question is, how did the pharmaceutical industry start? Who started it? And was there a change in the doctors that we're using? And what sort of doctors did we have before the pharmaceutical industry came along? These are questions that need to be analysed. And if you start to analyse them, you start to see a different picture. It's a picture that the mainstream media are never going to tell you. And then, of course, you've got that problem of discussing with somebody who believes that the narrative of the mainstream media is true. So you're not going to get your information across to them. And just to let you know, it took 3 years of my investigation before a defining moment hit, and I realised you can't keep pretending what you're learning not to be true. There seems to be an element of truth in what I'm seeing here. I began to see the money system as it worked. I started to research. That's why when I came to you, Martin, and to John Adams, I actually asked these questions. I'm not an economist, I said that. I said, I'm happy to be ridiculed, because if I don't ask the questions, I'm not going to know. I could be wrong, but I see what I see, and you actually verified what I saw. You said, you're right. So that's why I was able to do those other Down the Rabbit Hole series with you on the banking system and where we are today. I mean, we don't have a money system. The RBA, is it an Australian bank? Is it a private bank? I'll ask you that question, Martin, if you could explain that one to me. What's your thoughts?
Well, the RBA is a government entity in Australia. So, in fact, of course, it makes a profit and passes the profit back to the government here. It's not the private structure like in the US, where the Fed is actually a series of private of entities. Yeah, I mean, look, we're coming sort of to the end of the conversation. Yeah. But and I should say, I don't necessarily agree with nor endorse where you go down the rabbit hole, but
I fully expect you shouldn't.
I absolutely, defend your right to ask those questions and to think about it. My point is, if you come back to where we started this conversation, if we're not careful, we get fed a particular line. That particular line goes through the media channels on a regular basis. And so if we're not careful, we end up effectively just dancing to the tune that somebody else is dictating, right? What I do defend is the right for people to actually ask hard questions and to stand back and say, hang on a moment, but what if that isn't true? What alternatives are there? And, adults should be able to explore that and, frankly, find alternatives and, make up their own mind rather than just relying on media.
Martin, there is the alternative media. I mean, let's get this straight. You are alternative media because you're prepared to actually ask the questions.
Right.
There are others as well.
Yep.
Because I've been to the protests, I can tell you now that when I turn up to the protesters seem to look at each other and it's almost like telepathy. They can tell. They know, they say, do we really need to speak anymore? We all seem to know what's going on.
Yeah.
And it's a completely different story to what's coming out of the TV sets at night.
Yep.
To me, you believe what you see because it makes sense, but it's easy to kind of lead people in a particular direction. And before you know it, if you get enough people agreeing on a topic, the topic then becomes reality, it becomes the truth.
Yep.
What's the truth? Is the truth, or is it what a majority of people say, yes, we agree?
Well,
which one is the truth?
You know, there was somebody many years ago who said, what is truth, right? And I think that's a very important question, and maybe that's as we come to the end of the conversation here. You know, sometimes truth is not what you think it is. Sometimes truth is not what is reported in, you know, mainstream media in every day, in our you know, maybe there are other things. But then you got to also say, well, but sometimes, of course, the truth is the truth. It's just a matter, it's hard sometimes to discover which is true and which isn't. So that's why I'm a skeptic, and I'm skeptical of pretty much everything. And, you know, I like to try and, as far as I can, validate what I see from sources perhaps other than just what was on the TV last evening.
Well, I'll tell you what, for the people who watch on the side and don't seem to want to partake, I'll finish off the conversation with this little kind of sentence that was structured about getting to the truth and actually standing your ground. So it goes something like this. First they came for the socialist, and I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the unionists, and I wasn't a unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was nobody left to defend my voice. I think it's a very powerful statement. What it says is you need to be alert. You need to consider when something is not right. It's up to us to do the investigation. If we believe the media is not being true, we need to do our own investigations and to hold them to account. Good luck with that, by the way. But this is where we're at. I kind of think that if I wasn't being too abrupt, I think we're living something similar to Joseph Goebbels' Germany. Which should be pretty scary to anybody watching this show, because on an international scale, by the way, not on one country this time, and I think that's where we are. Now, for the people who think this is a little bit crazy, that's okay, because if you told me this 20 years ago, I would be looking at the person on this screen right now and I'd say, oh, he's definitely got a tinfoil hat on, this one, little bit strange. Don't think I like what he's saying. He sounds a bit odd. That's not what I see on the TV. What's he talking about? This is where we're at, Martin. I think election 2022 is going to be an interesting one. And I think that we might just see the balance of power tipped on both major parties, and they're worried about it, I'll tell you. They are very worried about it. They want their left-wing or right-wing paradigm. The fact of the matter is, original democracy never worked with the left or the right. It worked with the group as a whole. But then, did we have an international media working the way it does today? It's very, very powerful. I think we can leave it there, Martin. It's been a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, George, and you know, for your insights and for your opinions. And like I say, you know, I don't expect people necessarily come down the same rabbit hole as you. But the point is, there are some important questions that we've been discussing tonight about the way the media works, what stories get out, how they get out, to what extent did they tell the truth or not.
Yep.
And you know, I guess my message to everybody is be skeptical and remember that truth can be a bit flexible, and truth and propaganda can bleed into each other quite quickly. And once that happens, then of course you are effectively being controlled. George, thanks for that. We'll catch you again next time.
Bring in the music, Martin.
Thanks.